Well, hello, Internet friends. Welcome to this edition of Tools for Living. I'm Pastor Mike Lopp with Trinity Baptist Church. This week we are kind of continuing our Bible study in our Old Testament series. We're piggybacking off of last week, which was titled Trusting God Against All Odds. And the alternative of trusting God against all odds we learned today from Numbers 14 is essentially rebellion against God. The title of this message is Before You Rebel. Now, let me talk a little bit about the circumstances of this text, and then we'll have you pause the video and read it. But what's going on here is Numbers 14 is the purposeful recollection of how God, in righteous anger, judged the Israelites for their contempt and unbelief and their rebellion against His command to enter into the land. The judgment was significant, and you can read about that. Let's talk about the timing, though. The book of Numbers was written 40 years after the event that you're about to read, okay? It was written for the children and grandchildren of those who are involved in this story. Their parents and grandparents rebelled, and when they read this chapter, this book of Numbers, they're reading about what their parents failed to do. Okay, so that's kind of a part of the situation. So it's for the children and grandchildren, 40 years after it happened. Now the situation then is that the congregation of Israel seems to Moses to be on the verge of repeating the same sin of their parents, because we get a warning in the 20th chapter of Numbers not to repeat this. In Numbers 20, you see some of the same symptoms of contempt and unbelief, and a warning to them not to repeat the sin of the 10 spies who came back and gave the negative report that we read about in chapter 13. So as you read the text, I want you to listen to it as though it was your father and grandfather who had been among those that you're reading about, and you are probably one of those who are getting ready to go in and take the land. So stop now and read chapter 14 of the book of Numbers, and then join back. Okay, so Numbers 14. One of the things I wanted to point out to you was verse 9. Let's go back to verse 9. When Joshua was trying to lead the congregation of Israel differently than the 10 spies who were faithless, he says, "Only do not rebel against the Lord." But remember, this warning is now in writing. Okay, first it was a warning to those who were rebelling. Now it's a warning to those who are reading it, who are about to enter the land. So by reading the story, the recipients of Numbers are receiving a warning not to rebel in the way their fathers and grandfathers did. What I want to spend the rest of my time focusing on this morning, or in this Bible study, is the consequences of rebelling against God. And the first one that we see in this text is that when we rebel, we provoke God towards judgment of us. Now, this was true in the Old Testament, but it's also true in the New Testament. Some people don't think God judges or disciplines in the same way, but we read in 1 Peter where the apostle in the New Covenant era says to Christians, it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. He's talking to Christians who are ambivalent about moving forward in God's plan and in sharing the gospel because there's persecution arising and it's going to be tough, just like it was going to be tough for the children of Israel to go take the promised land. It was tough for Christians then. And when we rebel against moving forward in God's program of advancing His kingdom and spreading His word, okay, we provoke God to anger because He has demonstrated for us. He has a track record of signs and wonders and faithfulness that we should trust Him as He leads us to whatever our next steps are in seeking His kingdom and advancing His kingdom. The second consequence we see screaming out from the text is that when we rebel, we cheat ourselves. The children of Israel cheated themselves out of the promised land. Did you notice that? They didn't get to go in. They should have been experiencing peace in the land by the time this was read, but they weren't. Their fathers and grandfathers who died in the wilderness missed out on being the generation that took the promised land, that led God's people in one of the most critical times of the development of God's program of redemption. I mean, they gave up so much simply because they were afraid. Their fear led to contempt. Their contempt led to disobedience, and that led to rebellion. And they cheated themselves. They thought they were protecting themselves, but they weren't. They were cheating themselves. What's more is the third consequence. They not only cheated themselves, when they rebelled, they cheated their children. See, by this time, the land would have been conquered and settled 40 years later. But instead, their children suffered in the wilderness, eating manna and quail every day, being shepherds in a rough terrain, waiting for their parents and grandparents to die, and then they were going to have to do the hard, bloody work of war because their parents left it to them to do. The rebellion of the children of Israel cheated not only themselves, it cheated the next generation. It cheated their children and grandchildren out of 40 years in the land and out of the blessing of their parents having gotten that land for them. And so it is never worthwhile for us to rebel against God. There's always cost, there's always sacrifices in obeying God, but that's always in our best interest, even if it means laying down our lives. We have one life to live. We have one life to give to the glory of God and to be used for advancing His kingdom and spreading His word and proclaiming the gospel and taking Christ to the nations. One life to live. So let's not live it in fear. Let's live it in faith, with courage, with strength, dedication, commitment, no matter what it may cost us. And we may find out in the end, God actually did mean it for our good. Well, God bless you, and thank you for joining me for this edition of Tools for Living, and I hope to see you again. God bless.